How's it going, everybody? Welcome to this live stream edition of the AVB podcast. Today, there we go. I haven't changed those particular settings. I'll have to fix that as we go so that we're not blurring in and out. But we are here today. We're going to be talking with a very good friend of mine, Mr. Brendan Byrne. I'm going to screw up your name after calling you a very good friend. Brendan, how's it going, buddy?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Just bringing you up here. I guess we'll get started just by getting right into your background a little bit. Why don't we tell the folks who you are, why we're talking to you, your background in farming, and we'll let people know about that part, and we'll kind of go deeper into the conversation from there.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Brendan Byrne. I farm just outside of the town of Essex. We do about 1,200 acres, corn, soybeans, and wheat. I'm the vice chair for the Grain Farmers of Ontario, which is like a membership organization. We got 28,000 grain farmers across the province of Ontario that we represent. So I'm heavily involved in a lot of different things that are happening provincially and federally in terms of discussions for grain farmers and their issues, as well as I represent this district, which is District 1, which is Essex. So I've been involved in farming essentially my whole life since I was a little guy. Took a few detours after university and whatnot, but have found a solid footing here and live out on the farm just outside of Essex with my wife and two teenage kids.
You've been doing this your whole life, though, right?
Yeah, I remember being a little guy and handing dad the tools and driving around and falling asleep on tractors and whatnot. So it's been since I was a real little kid. I remember the first time we ever moved was they were loading stuff into tomato wagons from the house to move to the next house. So that was the one big move, but we were out to the 100-acre farm, and that's where my parents still are, and we're on 48 acres right around the corner from them. So
That's amazing. So talk to me a little bit about your journey, kind of, because I mean, there are a lot of farmers, but not every farmer takes what they're doing to the organization level. But that seems to be a passion of yours right from early on, right?
yeah, it's one of those things where in the farming community we've got an older population generally. So when the young guys show up for a meeting, even just to show up and see what's going on, you tend to get nominated for stuff. So I was nominated early on for vice chair of a couple smaller groups or to get involved in boards locally, and that evolved into where I am now. And yeah, I like the leadership aspects. I like leading groups and being part of that. I've done the agricultural leadership program in Ontario as well, which, as we were chatting about before, took me to Spain in January and Texas last year and a few different places to learn about agriculture and kind of widen that scope.
So talk to me about the specific boards that you're sitting on right now, and sort of what they do and how they're involved in the food supply chain process.
Sure. Well, as I said, like I sit locally as the chairman, the director, I guess, for District 1, which is Essex,
Mhm.
for the Grain Farmers of Ontario, also the vice chair for the province. And then I do sit on Ontario Soil or Essex Soil and Crop Improvement Association as well
Mhm.
down here. And essentially, anything to do with grain, we're involved with. So the bulk of it is corn, soybeans, and wheat that will go into feed systems, whether it's to feed animals, whether it's to feed for human consumption, or whether it's to be part of our fuel usage with corn going into ethanol production.
Okay.
So we're kind of on that side of we provide the feed for animals. We have the soy and whatnot that goes into some specialty markets across the world for tofu production, things like that. So we're involved pretty much from the time you put it in the ground to the time that you're trying to get it into people's hands, consumers' hands.
So outside of your actual work on the farm that you're doing, what are some of your organizational roles in all of this? Like what is your job in all of these groups?
So for the Grain Farmers of Ontario is the main one. So that's the vice chair position, and so I'm just below our chairman. So I assist him with whatever is going on at a high level, sitting on our executive board. Our board has 15 members. We have four on the executive, and we try to go through whatever issues our farmer members are facing, try to be out front of them, try to see what we can do to help. and at the same time, in something like this, be a little reactive, but also try to find ways that we can help guys go through and figure out what they can do on their operations to maybe lessen some of the stress or some of the various things that are going on with them. So on that, in that executive role, like I sit on government relations committees, I sit on communications committees. I was helping to hire our latest CEO that we did. So you do a lot of stuff for the organization, but I find it to be personally rewarding, trying to help out the farmers of Ontario. It's something that I take very seriously and want to make sure that I've always looked at a legacy piece. So the legacy of our family farm is now kind of entrusted to me, and at some point will be entrusted to my kids or my nephews or nieces. And I look at that across the province and look at the legacy that farmers have built and try to help them sustain their operations.
So let's sort of get into the meat and potatoes of this. How is what's going on in our world right now with COVID affecting farmers, supply chains, and that kind of things? What are you hearing from your organization members?
Well, the big issues that we're kind of discussing right now are it's a bit of unknown as everybody we're kind of this is a new normal where we're quarantined and we're inside and we're trying to plan out what we're going to do. But in the next say 2 weeks or so, if the weather cleared up, we would be out doing our usual operations on the farm. As of right now, we are an essential service to plant the crops and get the safe food into the hands of Canadians that we always do. And we're looking at issues that are possibly things. I reached out to a few of our suppliers or our dealerships and asked them that question a couple days ago. And people are worried about if a mechanic gets sick at a shop and then having to shut the shop down for 2 weeks in a busy season and having farmers kind of stranded, not being able to get parts, not being able to get a mechanic out. And then if the weather flips, not being able to actually get a crop in the ground. Um, a lot of guys have been really good with deliveries and whatnot so far. There's that hands off. You let me know where you want your corn put, and I will drop it in the shed for you, or I will put the beans in the wagon. I've seen a lot of dealers doing that, but there's that big unknown that's out there, and we are an older population generally in our farm community, so that's the most at risk people. Then, and that's what we're hearing from all the newscasts. So we're concerned that our members are going to be getting out there all of a sudden at a time when it's not necessarily to their best interest to maybe be out and trying to move around, but we give them the resources and hopefully each farming operation can safely plant a crop. As for some of the other supply chain things with food, like I don't have animals personally, but I feel very badly for some of the guys that I've spoken to that do have animals because some of the processing facilities are being shut down when workers are getting COVID. I saw a couple reports from the states today that way. There could be some shortages on some meat, but we've got a very resilient group, and I think they'll find solutions, and we'll be able to work through this as best we can.
It's interesting to me because this is the food supply chain is one of those topics that in all of this I've heard little bits and pieces that kind of pop up to the surface, but it to me it might be one of the most concerning parts of all of it, right? Because as we're learning to deal with the structures of all of how the world's going to move forward under COVID, the food supply chain sort of relies on a lot of different pieces and a lot of travel and a lot of interconnectivity, right?
Sure.
So,
yeah. No, go ahead. I was going to say that, and I think that part of it is just in this new normal. While you and I are sitting here trying to sort out how to connect virtually and have these discussions, there are plants and farms and animal like people raising animals that are having the same discussions
right.
as to how to make sure this can happen effectively and efficiently. Because yeah, this is the first time in my life that I've ever went to a grocery store when this first started, and the toilet paper thing wasn't as concerning to me as a whole empty section of meat and bread.
Yeah.
And not having that in the store was an eye opener for a lot of Canadians. But at the time, it was the usual demand would be this, so that's what was in the stores. So since then, they've been able to rebound and stock the shelves, and I feel they'll be able to do the same as we go. It's just a bit of an adjusting period at times.
Now, does like a front end supply chain change like that end up working its way back down the system to folks like you? Like, do you guys end up feeling anything from that?
Well, for us, it has affected members already in different ways in which would be normal, say, the ethanol plants. When you look outside your window and there's not that many cars going around, the demand for ethanol is now lower. So that being mixed into our fuel system. So I've talked to guys that they're feeling the cash flow crunch because they had corn that was supposed to be delivered to ethanol plants on April 1st, and they still don't have a date that the actual plant will take it and fill that demand. So I know they're working through it, and we hope that at the end of this, we'll still have some of these markets that we had going into it. And I'm sure in some cases, like yeah, like if a processing place isn't open and people aren't raising the animals, then on our end it would trickle down to the supply being or the demand being less for some of the stuff that we grow.
I know you're not specifically in the dairy industry, but do you have any perspective on, like, we're hearing reports of, you've got grocery stores that are limiting the amount of milk that people can purchase because they're trying to deal with the empty shelf issue. But then at the same time, we're getting reports about dairy farmers like dumping excess milk and stuff. Do you have any perspective on that? Like, I realize it's a little outside of your specific field, but.
Yeah, it's outside of my field. The only thing that I can say is that, like, it comes to with that some of that processing and whatnot. You can't just take milk off of a farm and put it into a bottle and deliver it. So there is a processing that goes on with that as well. So if that processing facility can't take it, that would be the issue there. In general, I can tell you that in meeting with dairy farmers across the province in the last few years, or meeting people that have dairy, their priority is always to get exactly what the consumers need into the stores, and that hasn't changed. It's just a matter of whether the people that they would be delivering the milk to can handle it. And I think it is one of those bottlenecks that it just occurred because there wasn't an expected demand, and all of a sudden with people being home, and you see a lot of cooking and stuff going on Facebook, and you see a lot of these other things that people weren't necessarily at home cooking meals all the time. They were picking stuff up on their way home. Now all of a sudden people are going in and trying to grab a few jugs of milk and some flour and some eggs and go home and whip something up, and that's not what usually happens around us. So when all of a sudden everybody's got that same idea, I'm cooped up in the house, I might as well whip up X, Y, and Z cookies, and or I can drop off some delivery packets to people, which is fantastic. That's where the demand wasn't necessarily there when this started, and now it is. And I think our farmers, like I say, they're a resilient bunch. They'll work their way through and work with the processors as best they can to try to make sure the shelves are stocked. Because like I say, where like you say, when I saw that like empty milk shelves, I was in my store and I had plenty of milk and plenty of eggs and stuff like that. So I think part of it is regionalized as well. Just maybe tough time getting into certain areas or deliveries and stuff.
We got a question here from Chris Marintet. He asks, in this scenario, do you see backyard farming becoming more acceptable, or more accepted and practiced as people look to supply themselves? Can community gardens survive social distancing? What's your perspective on that end of it?
I think that everybody should have a garden. I mean, growing something is it connects you to this planet. It connects you to what farmers see every day. Like we always look at, we consider ourselves kind of the original environmentalists in all this. So sometimes when we get into those discussions, we wonder why we get looked at differently.
It is an interesting perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the backyard farming, I think in terms of growing your own fruits, vegetables, all that stuff is fantastic. Animals, like I say, I don't have the necessary background in that. I know that it's a lot more difficult than maybe people think. I think it sometimes comes down to one of those things where people, like when you hear the stories of people bringing a rabbit home to give to a kid on Easter, and then all of a sudden, a month later, all these rabbits are just getting let out because nobody has any concept of how to take care of them. I think if it's done properly, there's probably a place for it in communities. The community gardens, I I would think there'd be a way to work around that if a community said, you know what, on this day, these three plots are available and they're spaced out, and you can do some stuff. Or if you grow something for your neighbor, and everybody's washing fruits and vegetables and everything else now anyway. So I think that some of those things can maybe bring us a little closer together, so that when these things do finally end, maybe you know your neighbor a little better, or you say, you know what, you grow great tomatoes and I got cucumbers, and let's divvy it up here and help each other out.
Absolutely. When I think of farming, like outside of the greenhouse sort of system or whatever, but the idea in my head is that it's a pretty solitary lifestyle. Is that accurate, or is there a lot of interaction in the day to day?
Um, it, I think I tend to gravitate towards it because it's a solitary lifestyle. I've gotten through a lot of stuff because of a kind of a stoic way about me, and I like to be on equipment and not connected to the world, and just be able to sit with my thoughts and kind of think through some stuff and maybe come out of it with a clearer head. But our farmers generally are pretty connected. You'd be surprised if you went on Twitter during planting season, harvest season, or just prior. There's a few hashtags that people will put, whether it's like there's an Ontario agriculture one, there's plant 20, I think they're just using plant 20, I guess, for planting this season. So there's a lot of chatter that goes on in amongst them. And there's a lot of coffee shops that like right now, obviously not happening, but there's a lot of coffee shops. I've been surprised where we were headed to a hockey tournament and it was 5 o'clock in the morning, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna run and I'm gonna get a bunch of coffee to bring to the parents. A few years back, and there were six farmers sitting in the corner having coffee and chatting, and that's something they did almost every day. So there's it's a community sense. It's that old school kind of, some of the older guys not necessarily sitting there texting and virtual chatting, but they're meeting each other and they're having these discussions as well. Like right now, obviously that's not happening, but it's a pretty good community to be part of.
It's interesting because when right before you and I went live here, we were kind of talking about the fact that um, that it's a challenge for a lot of the farmers, a lot of the farming community to sort of get on board with the technology to be able to sort of have these kinds of conversations, these kinds of meetings. Do you want to talk a little bit about that perspective? Because you were saying it's an older demographic. We are talking about people, not everybody, of course, like you just said, but we're talking about a group of people that aren't necessarily spending their time, figuring out all the latest technology stuff. What's the process now of maybe getting them on board into these sort of systems so that they can move forward with in these sort of like distancing times, right?
Yeah, it's always a challenge because this is kind of a new way of doing things. So I think some guys were on Facebook, they were on Twitter, but they weren't necessarily doing live chats or live meetings or things like that. But I mean, even one of the suppliers that we deal with the other day reached out to me and said, "Can I talk to you on Friday?" And I said, "Yeah, that's fine." And they said, "Well, why don't I send you a link and we'll do a Zoom chat?" So I think even some of the people that maybe are knowledgeable have been helping out some of the farmers as well. But I did a speech on Tuesday on mental health for one of the larger companies that are in Canada, companies dealing with agriculture. And there was a few hundred people that had all logged on, and they did a virtual meeting instead of I was supposed to do it in person. We were supposed to have our largest event is about 800 to 1,000 people in London in March, so we had to cancel that. So we've found ways to connect as a board virtually, and I think it's in this stage, it's kind of that, you know what, I don't know exactly what I'm doing. You might not know exactly what you're doing. Let's just figure it out same way we would a piece of equipment. So guys they understand this is how it is. I mean, my parents even my dad doesn't do video chats, or my mom, but all of a sudden we have done some. So like things like that are happening, and people are obviously getting a little more comfortable with it. But that being cooped up part of it, I think some of the guys will be happy to put the electronics away when they can finally sit at a dinner table with friends and relatives and actually connect.
Absolutely. Bit of a different subject here. Bronwyn Wood, who said hello earlier. I know you know Bronwyn as well.
Sure.
She says docs look at the darker side of the huge factory farm systems that aren't always sustainable to humans. Do you think that that harms the image of smaller farms that are critical to the food supply chain? So basically, what's your take on the public documentary side of what you're seeing in the food supply chain stuff?
Well, I can tell you that on my side of it and going through with communications and different things like that and being around, fear will always sell more than the good story.
Mhm.
So if I want to go out and find somebody who's doing a poor job at whatever, you can name whatever industry, I can find it. But I know that when some of that happens and people talk about corporate farming and things like that, what they're not necessarily understanding is corporate farming is also could be myself set up as a corporation just to have my farm underneath it.
Right.
Um, and in terms of the actual documentaries that are out there, there are some really good ones that promote agriculture, and I know those people have had a really tough time even trying to get anybody, say Netflix or otherwise, to put a opinion up against some of the stuff that is out there. So in some cases, like I remember I watched Food Inc. and there were parts of it that I thought, you know what, I identify with pieces of this that I think are pretty good, and other parts that I was like, nah, that you looked for that and you found it. And I've never been on a farm in Ontario that I have felt unsafe. I've never been on a farm in Ontario that I've felt that our food supply was unsafe. I feel that the farmers in this province that I've met, and even across Canada that I've met at other conferences, the number one thing that they have is the safe food, and that's what they want to provide. And I've talked to people from all different areas, all different stripes, ages, and they're doing the very best they can to provide safe, economical food for Canadians. And I've yet to see any of these instances live where I've looked at it and scratched my head or walked away and said, "My goodness, I can't believe that was happening." I've actually went to places and looked at it with a open eye and thought, "This is way different than I thought," because I was looking at it through a lens of something I may have seen on a documentary that showed it. And I look and I'm like, this is really clean, and this is really like well done, and the technology is high. And so I've been in the opposite, where because I'm in the industry, I've been pleasantly surprised everywhere I went that I've never had any of those issues pop up around me, or I've never had anybody reach out to me saying, "Did you know so and so is doing this, and can you help?" Because they just are few and far between, I think.
Well, it's funny too because you brought up farmers being like the original environmentalists, and the other part of this that sort of just occurred to me as you were talking is like everybody that I know that deals with animals, and now mind you, I don't know many people that work with like, you know, cows that are going to slaughter on a regular basis or whatever, but even truck drivers that I've known that have hauled cows that were going to slaughter, that were dealing with pigs that were going to slaughter, everybody that I've ever dealt with, like these people love these animals. Like I understand what's happening, you know, to them at the end or whatever as part of the process, but when you get them aside and you talk to them, what you find from them more often than not is how much they really care about what they're doing, and what they're doing is keeping these animals. Like, and it's not just about
Yep.
a money process.
Yeah, and people can have a difference of opinion in what we should be eating or what they want to choose to eat. That's always up to them. It's more trying to make sure there's a fair and accurate portrayal out there of what's going on. And as you're saying this, like the only times I've ever been worried as a Canadian seeing some of these food production kind of things is when activists have been trying to uh, give liquids to, say, pigs that were going through to be slaughtered, and not knowing as a consumer what they're actually doing, what they're actually putting in, because the farmers know exactly what's been into that pig. They know exactly how much it's ate. They know what weight it is, what all those different things that have happened. And at the end of it, going into the final part of it, at some of these abattoirs or whatnot, you're having people showing up and trying to to pretend they can feed a pig some water because they feel that they're malnourished, and that's not the case. So those are things that do come up on the radar once in a while, and I feel for our farmers that have to deal with that on a somewhat more regular basis.
Um, Sorry, we did have another question that just popped down from where I can read it, but I'll just sort of I'll summarize it a little bit. With what we're seeing with the milk being dumped and that kind of thing, are you and your membership, the people that you're talking to, is there a concern for you guys that you're going to have like shortages? Like, are there things that you guys are seeing from all of this that the general public isn't seeing that's worrying you?
Worrying me in general is just the same worries that most people in Ontario have, and that gets amplified by our older demographic in our farm communities. I worry about guys losing a member of their operations that was a key point, and then all of a sudden they can't plant crops. We will rally together to try to get some of that stuff done, but overall shortages and whatnot, I think we're at the early stages of this, and I think, like I say, some of the processing and stuff just has to get sorted out. Because at the same time, processing, truck drivers, things like that, if somebody gets sick, then all of a sudden it's a mandatory quarantine to take care of the other people around them. So in some cases, the shortages aren't coming from a lack of product; they're coming from a lack of a harder way to get it into the stores. So at this tip of it, I'm not as worried about the supply. In our grain farming, we're always at the mercy of the weather and weather events as to what yield we end up being able to produce. So we can't count on anything at the beginning. We can't at the beginning say we're going to plant this and automatically get this anyway. So we'll plant with a lot of hope and the hope that the weather cooperates and we have a more abundant amount of grain. But there are storage facilities and whatnot that have enough that will get us through plenty of this.
How connected to um, greenhouse farmers are you?
Not at all. I meet a handful of them at meetings, but I know little to nothing about any of their
So when we hear
operations.
stories about like bringing in migrant workers and stuff like that, that's more of a greenhouse farming issue rather than an issue with you guys, right?
It would be a greenhouse issue. It is a issue for some of our members, but very few. For example, like some of them up in I guess it would be like a Ridgetown, Blenheim area, where there is still some of that really black dirt, and there may be still some tobacco production. There's a lot more migrant workers being called into areas there, but not necessarily connected to our grain farming operations, more a fruit and vegetable, and which would just be kind of an offshoot of some of our members that grow corn, soybeans, and wheat might also have some higher level vegetable production. So I know they're trying to sort some of those things out.
Do you have any perspective on that issue at all, or?
I think that it's a tough spot because you're looking at where some of these people are coming in from. But at the same time, the amount of work that has to be done on some of these farms, I get that people say sometimes that maybe there's some high school or college kids that would get out there and do it. They simply wouldn't. These
I did it when
workers,
I was 13. I did it for one summer. You couldn't pay me enough to go back.
yeah, and that's the thing, right? It's very very labor intensive, and it takes a specialty in knowing what to do as well in some of these cases. So I think that my only perspective is that I hope that it works itself out safely. I know they're talking about how they can house some of the workers coming in and checks and stuff like that go into the process for them coming. But it's a very important part of agriculture in this province, just not something that I necessarily have my hand in.
I think we haven't really touched too much on like we've talked about food safety a little bit, but it sort of just occurred to me that the conversation about COVID specifically and how it interacts with food is sort of like mostly it's left alone to it's left at it doesn't look like it's being passed through food, But also the other perspective on this, I don't think people really have an understanding of just how intense the food safety measures are, specifically even here in Ontario, here in Canada. Can you go over like just some of that? Like I know it's tough to sort of like it's a very open-ended question, but can you talk to me a little bit about what the process of food safety is from what you guys see?
Yeah, like on a real low level kind of thing, the you can't put anything out into the food system that hasn't been thoroughly evaluated, that hasn't been looked at by government and by science and different things like that in terms of food safety and in terms of how things need to operate and how things be done. And I know at the when we were growing some identity preserve beans that would go into tofu and things like that in Japan, and even then, like we were having to provide like a traceability kind of map of, okay, so where'd the seed come from, what day did you plant it on, what chemicals, if any, got put on the ground, what did you do fertilizer wise, what did you do at harvest time, what day were they harvested, where were they put, when did they get shipped. So there's a lot of things like that do happen on a farm level. And I know with animals and whatnot, even though it's not my specialty, they can tell where things are coming from. So the food safety in Canada has always been a badge of honor. We've had people coming to look at people growing some of these, say, identity preserved beans in Ontario, coming from Japan, saying that they wanted Ontario farmers have the right climate to grow them. But the bigger part was that they felt that they were some of the safest farmers on the planet, and they wanted that for their food system. So we get kind of recognition those ways in that what we're doing is right. But I think in general, the food safety in Canada is always a high priority for farmers, and you can see it in that the actual issues and stuff coming out of food or something coming up that shows that there was a safety issue are very few and far between. Whereas you might see a bit more of it in the U.S. Where things are getting recalled and stuff like that, where we don't see a lot of stuff coming from Canada that is having those issues.
Um, Chris asks, speaking of migrant workers, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but speaking of migrant workers, is there a concern of bringing people across the border for harvest time and it being restricted? How far ahead are contingency plans being forecasted? But like you were saying, I don't know that that's specifically the area you deal with too much, right?
Right. I don't deal with that too much. I think that industry is trying to work through it at this time. So I think even if people are in that industry, they'd say there's a lot of uncertainty just in general. I mean, even here, like my dad works off the farm but works in the U.S., so he's not crossing at all to go work. So crossing borders has become an issue in all areas. And I mean, for grain farmers, we aren't necessarily looking at it from a human perspective. We're looking at it as even parts and things like that would ordinarily be trucked across from the U.S. and at border crossings, whether we're going to be able to get some of that stuff. But I think that the people that are utilize the migrant worker system, they're at the point right now where they're trying to work through as best they can. I know there's been a few announcements from there's a senator that I know that had said that they were working on it, as well as the Minister of Agriculture. So,
Gotcha. Sorry, just had another question come in. Oh, gotcha. Yeah, the fields by Chris's mom's place were harvested by migrants, so it might be one of the fruit or tobacco farms or whatever. So,
yeah,
um,
even like in this area, it could be tomatoes,
right.
um, things like that do still happen. Out Leamington Way, I know they've got a lot of tomato grounds still out there, but I'm not sure what all the setup is.
Gotcha. Um, you're saying right now you guys are in a holding pattern, kind of waiting for the weather to break. But I'm guessing that this is probably like a pretty busy tooling time, like getting prepared, like getting ready for the time when it is going out. Well, A, is my assumption correct, and B, are you seeing any issues in getting the supplies of things that you need?
Yeah, you're right, it is a tooling time, getting things pulled out and shined up as best you can. We always joke around on the farm that you put something away for essentially 11 months and then expect it to work perfectly for that 1 month that you need it. And when we pull it out, you'll find all the issues in those first couple days, no matter how you've looked over the equipment. I have talked to some guys just on a basic level that things that ordinarily would easily be at shops aren't available. Um, I had a guy talking to me about grease that would be used for bearings and whatnot to keep things moving, and he it was on back order and he can't get it for 3 weeks. I had somebody else talking about some nuts and bolts for like a tillage kind of perspective that he said he called 5 different places and they're on back order with no date showing as to when they might get there. So there are some of those early indicators that there's going to be some hard times, because ordinarily if I'm out in the farm or on the farm and planting or harvesting or anything, if I have an issue, I can call our dealerships. The next day, they might have parts in that I can go pick up. They get a mechanic out to help me with it, or just for like band aids and baling wire type thing. You run to Canadian Tire, you run to TSC, grab whatever you think will get you through the night when those places are not available or it's going to take some time. And even those, like yesterday, I went to get some lights for our barn because we had some power outages here and I think they screwed up the bulbs and I had to wait 10 minutes outside TSC just to get in to get them, and our Canadian Tire store is closed. So there's going to be different things like that that ordinarily we take for granted. Just okay, jump in the truck, go grab this. That I think might slow us down. And my hope is that it doesn't prevent fields from being planted, because we are at the mercy of the weather. So if we get 5 nice planting days and your planter breaks down and you can't get that part for 3 or 4 days, and then the mechanic's having a tough time getting out, or a shop's quarantined, or all those different unknowns, you might have guys that can't get crop into the ground, and then all of a sudden a rain event happens, and you're kind of stressed out that way.
Is Chris asks, is there something that we can be doing to assist our farmers? Can we have an agricultural version of a barn raising?
I think any support for farmers is good by the general population and whatnot, because we try to do the best we can in these spots as well. So even if farmers are posting something and you're retweeting it or you're liking it, things like that, showing support. Because even behind the scenes, like, and it's not necessarily behind the scenes because it has been public, but like we haven't went out trying to overly promote, but like the Grain Farmers of Ontario, we donated $100,000 to Feed Ontario to fill some food banks. So in our plan with that was to see what we could do to help with some of the money we might have, and at the end of the day, it's going to provide food for 225,000 people. And so we're out here doing the best we can in all these struggles, and we hope that everybody else is doing okay with it as well. But more or less just showing support for what we're doing, or maybe some of the misinformation that goes on out there is maybe having some of those corrective things, or saying, you know what, I talked to a farmer and that's not correct, or I looked into that a little bit further, and I don't believe what that documentary showed was correct. Any of those things help our farm community for sure, because we deal with public trust issues all the time, and we try to navigate that as best we can, but getting the general public on side is always helpful.
Talk to me about a little bit about that side of it, because in not from an organizational point of view, but even just from a personal level, like it has to be fairly frustrating to see the way the general public, with being well-meaning from where they're coming from, are just completely missing like what happens in the real life side of farming. How do you sort of deal with that? And I know you deal with a lot of like mental health issues and stuff. So is that one of the things that you have to deal with in dealing with your membership?
Yeah, yeah. The question that always comes up is like you start to look at why maybe some of these public trust pieces come up that we have to go against, or we have to speak out on. And I think in general, like, you can't blame people at times because I don't know everything about the industry that those people are in. So if I saw a documentary on something they might be involved in and I just happened to watch the wrong one, I might have those same ideas, and it would take them and myself having a conversation for me to know otherwise. And I think at times in our society today, we can't actually have conversations. So, like, I appreciate having conversations like this because it can reach out and show people that you can have conversations. We tend to get into a silo, and this is my opinion, and I'm not even going to talk to that guy about it because I saw he posted this and he's clearly wrong because I saw this documentary. But if you can just sit down and have a chat with people and find out what's going on, if you have an issue with how animals are raised, reach out to a farmer and say, hey, I saw this and it made me feel wrong about it, and I just wanted to see like what goes on your operation. Is that possible? And not from an activist point of view that you want to go there and find the worst of it, but you want to go and just see what it actually is. Have that talk with people. And the mental health thing has been a big thing for me. The last few years, especially, I've had a lot more dealings with mental health and mental stresses. The farm community, we lost an amazing woman to suicide that was a good friend of mine, and she was looked at as a strong person in agriculture. She could present confidently. She was always out there, always quick-witted and sharing farm experiences. And she had a really tough time with mental health struggles, and then it finally took her. And personally, at home, my wife has had two separate hospitalizations for mental health, and in this latest case was dismissed from the hospital because they needed room for COVID potential beds. So without getting the help, was kind of sent home. So I find that until people actually have to deal with something, they don't necessarily know, and they don't know how they're going to react or what they're going to do. So I know I've had to hop off equipment and run to see my wife at the hospital, run back and hop on equipment and try to continue my farm operation. So once I finally shared that a few of those things had went on, I found that more guys wanted to at least chat with you about it or say, you know what, I had some of the same stuff. And I've had older guys even, they've asked me like, why do you guys spend so much time on mental health? Because we have a mental health and wellness committee. We reach out and partner with organizations. Like I said, I spoke at an event the other day, and I just say that I don't want people to have to find out about mental health the way that I did. I knew some postpartum depression kind of things, but I didn't live around suicide and mental health. And my wife was diagnosed as bipolar, so I didn't live in a house where I had all these things that you're trying to sort out and help with. And I look at it as not necessarily a farm end of it, but also just a generalized human kind of perspective on trying to help with some of these things. So in our farm community, did a mental health roundtable with the Minister of Agriculture. I was in a meeting with the Premier where I brought up mental health, and he pulled me aside and we spoke on the issue as well, and the importance that he saw in it. And I think that the more conversations we actually have, and the more that people are open to saying, you know what, I've been through some stuff, or not just even being through it, sitting on the outside trying to help, the better it is for everybody, because it's a huge issue. It's something that I'm concerned with during this quarantine, because when we come out of it, if this takes a lot longer than people are envisioning, if you're listening to the U.S. talking about opening things up and you think that that's going to be happening anytime soon, I don't think that that's going to be the case here in Canada. And people are going to get kind of cooped up, and they're going to have a tough time with some mental health struggles, and they're going to have a tough time getting the resources they might need. But if we can push the conversation to where I've had people reach out to me that I didn't necessarily know them, but they said, you know what, I identified with this and things are going shitty for me, and they know that I'll have that talk. The more we can do of that for our friends, our family, or just anybody in general, shows that human side of what we're doing, and that we're all kind of in this together. So we've had a big concern in our mental health for our farmers. The reports and studies show that we are at a much higher stress level than the general public. We are probably at a higher level for showing anxiety and depression, but we are also a older group that feels that they're resilient and can get through pretty much anything on their own. And the truth is they probably have in the past, and they probably can, but there's no shame in saying, you know what, at this time I can't really, so I'm going to get a little bit of help to get through.
Absolutely. We've had a couple of questions pop up. Just side topic for a second.
Yeah.
Number one, Chris wanted to know if people want to get accurate and current information about the food supply chain, about farming, that kind of thing. What are some of the resources where they should be looking for, for not the Facebook stuff?
I always go back to the one-on-one contact with a farmer, and that can happen at a number of different levels. Like look into some of the Grain Farmers of Ontario. You can punch up our website and it'll show you all of the different stuff that we're doing. You can go on the Dairy Farmers of Ontario or the Beef Farmers and see what's going on there. There were a couple good documentaries that were put out. I can't remember. I think there was like a food something. Farm Don't Punch, the buzzwords that are going to bring up the really bad aspects of agriculture. If you punch up or even just like a really good resource, I guess, that I would say is if you're on YouTube and you look around and look for some of the farmers. Like I know there's This Farm Wife, who's in, I think, North Carolina, does an amazing job at like promoting agriculture and showing what they do on their farm. Sheepishly Me is a sheep farmer from Perth that I am friends with the husband and her. And Sandy Brock's amazing. Like she will take you on her farm every single day on Instagram and show you what they're doing and show you the care and love of these animals. Millennial Farmer. There's some of these bigger farm places that have decided to put themselves out there in terms of the social media stuff, but not just posting, but actually creating channels and content and things like that. Those are a few that I would look at.
Amazing. Bronwyn asks, should we be advocating for greater protection of farmland? Windsor green spaces are constantly threatened by sprawl and climate change. How can we protect farmland from being paved over?
It's a good question. It's something that I know when I was a kid, I would drive down Walker Road to go to the drive-in theater. Shows how kind of my age that's there.
Hey, there's still a theater there.
Yeah, and I remember when all of a sudden somebody said there was a Costco, and I thought, why are they putting it there? Because there's nothing there.
Right.
And now that whole space is paved over. I think that in some cases it's natural development that needs to happen. I don't want to get into the whole hospital versus farmland kind of discussion because I look at needs for communities as well as farmland. Right. But I think that in general, we get to a certain point where the sprawl becomes a bit much and we need to maybe protect some of our better farmland. There is some land that maybe the uses have been marginal over time anyway, that a farmer can say, you know what, like I've done everything I can to produce on this land. It's really not going to ever be high level production of anything on it. And maybe it's the right spot for a subdivision. Those are some of the planning decisions. I think in general, if something does come up, you have that discussion or look at it from an outside perspective as to why is this development happening? How is this affecting? And I know Annie Duke, the poker player, wrote a book, Thinking in Bets, and she talks about just kind of stepping back and seeing the overall picture from both sides.
It's a great
and
book,
not like, yeah, well, I'm glad that you've heard of it and read it. I think it's fantastic. And I think that more people should read it because myself as a farmer, if somebody comes up with a topic that they want to say negatively on the farm, I can pull myself away and look from their lens and say, like, how would this look if it was something that I didn't understand, or if it was something that, or what can I do better? And I think that in some of those discussions, we need to maybe pull back to the airplane view and look down and say, what does this really look like? And is this going to help? Or is this just another restaurant that we maybe don't need? Or is this another shopping plaza that we don't need? versus some necessities.
It's been incredible. Brendan, thank you for talking to me thus far. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think is important to get out there?
No, I think that in general, farmers they do the polls and they show that we're supposedly some of the most trustworthy people that are there, that title, and we take that very seriously. We try to do things in a manner that show or live up to the standards that our grandparents or great grandparents before us were doing, and continue that legacy. And at the same time, people can reach out anytime. I'm easy to find. If people type in Grain Farmers of Ontario, all of our cell phone and address and everything else is on there because we are active for our membership. Or you can find me on Instagram or those types of things as well if you have any other questions. But no, I appreciate the time to be able to share a perspective on grain farming that most people probably haven't heard. And then just in the hopes that people understand, and hopefully everybody can get through this current new normal and get back to their lives, but be safe in the process as we go about this.
Absolutely. Just sit right there. I'm going to talk to you once I've ended the stream here, but just hang on for a second. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this episode of the AVB podcast. If you have any comments or questions that happen after our live stream, feel free to throw them down below. I will try to pass those along to Brendan and get those answered as quickly as possible. In addition, if you are hanging out here, I don't know where you're watching. This is streaming out on Facebook and YouTube. Be sure to head on over to theavb.com. That'll take you to our YouTube channel. If you subscribe there, that does an awful lot to support what we're doing here. We're almost at that 1,000 mark, so we want to get there quickly. So thanks for all of that, and we will talk to you next time. We've got another couple of these that are lined up. I'll let you know exact dates on those as soon as we have them, and we will see you next time. Talk to you later, folks. Bye-bye.